Hi everyone and welcome to Content Melbourne. My name is Mark Welker and behind the scenes I've got the rest of the team, Gemma Bauman, Julia Fernandez and Justin Meneguzzi. If you're just joining us for the first time, maybe you don't know what Content Melbourne is all about. We are a community for industry and content creators. We're for everyone from strategists to copywriters through to journey managers. We run a range of digital and in-person events over the course of every year. And if you want more details, check out the links in the description below. It's got a link to our LinkedIn page, which you can find out a little bit more about the group. Before we get started and I'll introduce my guests, I want to put a big shout out to our sponsor, and I'm just going to put them up on the screen now. Team Content. These guys have been sponsoring us for a couple of years now, and we really appreciate their support over that time. This team is their purpose is to rid the world of bad content, and you can check out their link in the description below also. Okay, today this is the second session of our Content in Crisis series, which looks at how our content plans are shifting during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today we're talking about podcasts, and in particular we're looking at how branded podcasts help connect brands with their audiences. We're going to start off with a bit of a general introduction to the world of branded podcasts and then sort of weave in questions. So some of which we'll grab from the live feed and some of which people have already submitted over the weekend. We'll sort of get to those as they come. So get into the chat if you want to ask any questions and we'll go from there. For now, I'd like to introduce Courtney Carthy of Nearly Media. Welcome, Courtney.
Hello, thanks for having me. Great to be
No
here.
worries. Let's start off by telling us a bit about yourself and how you got into podcasting.
So, I was at uni studying journalism, and a friend of mine suggested that I should do some stuff with the with SYN in Melbourne, Student Youth Network, the radio station there, which suited me fine because it was easier and less time consuming than writing. I thought that was really cumbersome as a uni student, and then got stuck into radio. Went to the ABC in regional Victoria, came back to Melbourne, and worked for the ABC in different roles, mainly on live radio and digital content, for about 8 years, and finished up in digital strategy, working on podcasting, which is now, I think that department's called Audio Studio, which is the podcast department of ABC.
Right.
And I got interested in podcasting mainly because it was on demand. It felt frustrating that you had to tune into the radio at a specific time. You could explore. It seemed like a more free environment to explore ideas and topics and speak to people or listen to people. And then in 2017, I decided that podcasting could be a job, and set up a podcast production company called Nearly Media, which is where I am today, in our little studio in Fitzroy on Nicholson Street. And I also work with the Mushroom Group, setting up their podcast division as well. So Mushroom Group work across, there's like 30 companies, I think, in the Mushroom Group, which is like live music, live entertainment, artist management, services, royalties, all that sort of stuff. So the diversity of companies involved in podcasting and how people use podcasting since I started with branded and original shows in 2017 I wouldn't say it's changed a lot, but it's grown a lot in terms of what people are doing, the diversity of people involved, and the size of the ecosystem.
Right. And so let's talk about branded podcasts. So I did a little bit of research into this, went through the charts. So in the last couple of years, brands that have released podcasts include Westpac, Telstra, Domain, ANZ, Victorian Opera, LaunchVic, pretty much every university out there, including Melbourne University, Bupa. Why do brands turn to podcasts to reach their audiences?
Well, it's usually because they've got, something that they want to, well, because they've got something that they want to say to their audiences effectively. And more, that's been a story that they want to tell. So podcasting will fit a function. Initially, when in 2017, when I started talking to brands about it, there was just a drive to do a podcast, like when Facebook or Twitter started out, in the early noughties or early 2000s. It was like, we should be on Facebook. It's getting big. Then it was, we should have a podcast. Let's have a podcast. So people would quickly set up, some sort of production or get somebody in, like they would me, and put it together. And then the data started coming out about why podcasts were worth it, why they were beneficial and how they were beneficial. And that was really it's a cliche in the podcast sort of ecosystem, that they're intimate and engaging. So they have, you're basically talking one-on-one with the listener. They're listening, as I am, in their earbuds.
Yep.
And they're having this experience where they're building the pictures, like reading a book, they're building the pictures in their head. So each experience that they have with the podcast is unique and ideally beneficial. So it could be, informing or entertaining, or ideally a mixture of both. And one of the things that I'd seen as data was coming in on, on our tech platform that we use, you could see that time spent with podcasts was so much greater than time spent with other media. So if you have somebody reading a blog post, you might get, I think a bounce rate is the term for it, of, like 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Maybe with Facebook, you measure, somebody watching a video in, 3-second increments, or, you might max out a video at 90 seconds, which is changing from what I can tell. But with podcasts, you've got somebody, if you manage to get them to listen, because that's a hard part, it's 3 clicks, and you're competing with all the other stuff on their existing podcast app, and then only 25% of the population listens to podcasts. Mm-hmm. If you get them and you can hold their attention for the first couple of minutes, you've probably got them for the rest of the episode, or at least 80 or 90% of it. And that's 20 minutes where somebody spent a meaningful amount of time with, the content that you've provided. Now, with some of our branded, doing reports for our branded clients, what we've done is, sort of tallied up all of the minutes and hours spent listening, and you start getting into, thousands and thousands of hours, which becomes days, which becomes weeks spent with, maybe 6 20-minute episodes. And you might have had 1,000 people that spent 2 hours with your content. Now, to get 1,000 people to spend 2 hours at an event only interacting and talking about or listening to, one brand, like, you've got to pay them a reasonable amount of money, I think, or put on a pretty good show to get them there. Podcasting does that for much less if you get the right editorial angles, and, are able to pick out the stories, and then, build in the production, the artwork, and all the other stuff that goes through with it.
And how, this is a question that we got submitted during the week. How do you prove ROI, or what are some of the common sort of ways that sort of like a content manager would get an ROI calculation for doing a podcast in the first place?
It really depends on the brands. The different ways that people, the brands I've worked with measure ROI, they lean towards more government. They're having generally just a really good go at it, and, would like to see, thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, and have, told the stories of the stakeholders that, that they wanted to do. So it's more of a branding exercise, knowing that content will sit there for a while. In other campaigns that I've worked on for, like, a health insurance company, the podcast was a component of a new product that they had. So it would tell the stories of, people that product might help, and then ideally drive new customers towards that. Now, having not done like an integrated ROI report with the brand's, private data of, Facebook, web statistics, that sort of thing, and just sort of handing over the podcast data, that I know that they would do a comparison in terms of, we spent X amount on this channel, got this back in terms of engagement, and then compare that to the podcast to see how efficient it was.
Yeah.
One thing with brands, which I sort of, make sure I ask as often as possible, is like, why are you doing it, and what do you hope to get out of it? Because if people were looking for, or brands were really looking for that like viral sort of thing, we'll put it out there and hundreds of thousands of people will listen to it. Actually, it just doesn't happen. It's like social media is geared to that, and it's hard. Yep. Podcasting actively tries to stop things going viral just because of the structure of the content and the platforms.
Yep.
So it's extremely hard for that to happen. And being realistic about it in the first place is possible. And to get it's a bit of a shit answer to the question, but deciding what the measure of success is before you even consider what the next steps for a podcast might be is what's most important. Yeah. Actually, a better example I can give is an internal podcast for a large company. They've got a lot of people driving around in cars, workers driving around in cars. They never read their emails that they get sent, and there's about 600 of them across Australia. We did an internal podcast that was hosted by those people in the cars, that were able to come in and do an interview with some people that were maybe senior executives in the company. And the success was, did more people listen to the podcast than open those emails? And they did, because the medium was suitable and conducive to somebody driving around in a car.
Yeah.
Whereas an email wasn't. Email serves a much better purpose for plenty of communication than podcast. But in this instance, podcasting was a better medium and a better solution, and the ROI was immediate.
Yeah, so it's quite a flexible, I guess, communication method for brands. Like each might have their own purpose for the final communication or the reason why they're approaching it, and that ROI would adapt. For you, having worked in podcasts for so long, what are some of the basic things that determine success in a podcast? What do you feel like makes it work in the first place?
A basic standard of production quality. Mm-hmm. So, I'm in the studio. Using a microphone helps immensely. A phone line is terrible. Telling a story, or being clear that you're providing, specific information that people are probably unable to get anywhere else. So having, like a USP, unique selling point, and being honest about what information, you're giving. So delivering on the promise of what the title of the podcast is, and then also integrating it into other communications of the brand. I've seen brands that will start the podcast and they'll create a whole new brand for the podcast and then effectively siloing it so that content can't move from the podcast into the other streams of communication, like social media or web or live events or anything. It's put over there. Now, you wouldn't set up a whole new brand or a whole new Facebook page or a whole new event every time you just wanted to do something sort of smallish campaign. You'd integrate that into what all the assets and all the resources you've already got. And I think that's what's definitely changing with how brands approach podcasts. Using the marketing and communications capabilities that you've got in other channels to then drive those people, your engaged audience, to the podcast so that people are spending more time with your brand. And that might be just really basic stuff that goes, like including the podcast in accessible places on your website or in blog posts or posting about it on social media. A lot of people will make the podcast if they get to that point, and then that's done, and then just walk away, thinking that, it's the job's done. It'll, I've written an article for a newspaper. Now the newspaper takes care of it and it gets distributed everywhere. Well, for podcasting, there's no distribution method that actively goes out to those thousands of newsagents around the country and puts that newspaper down there. And it probably doesn't have any sort of a lot of awareness among the population. So you've got to create that as well. So 50% of the job is making the podcast. The other 50% is marketing it. And, keeping it relevant and letting your audience know why it's worth it. There's this big sort of, you can see in lots of podcasts, they spike and then they trail off and people will listen, all the way back. I see that in data, like, a year later, episodes will still be getting, new listeners that sort of pop up because if the content might be relevant to them at that time, or we've bothered to market it again, and people are discovering it for the first time.
Yeah. So let's talk about 2020. What are some the basic stats for podcasting or the sort of listener sort of behaviours going into 2020, and how have they sort of changed during the COVID crisis?
So before COVID, we crossed apparently 1 million podcasts published that are available on Apple Podcasts this year. So sort of seemingly sort of bit of a milestone. I mean, there are millions more books, millions more songs. So 1 million doesn't sound too much in terms of units of media. Home was the place where people said they listened to podcasts the most, and commuting or work was second. Commuting has dropped away because so many people are working at home, and now rather than there being a spike between 7 and 9 o'clock in the morning, the listenership just drifts up and then spikes between 11 and 1 when people maybe have got into their work day, they've got something that doesn't require them to, listen to anything. It might be a low period for meetings, and or they're, having a break. And I think we can send a link to an ARN study that was done with their podcast hosting platform Megaphone, and they showed this graph quite well, which is before and after the sort of significant events of this year. A good quote from the Spotify earnings call was that every day is the weekend.
Yeah.
So you have that sort of like hodgepodge listenership of the weekend when people are effectively doing different things, the same thing but at different times of the day. So there's no more, weekday predictability, which from what I can tell in the research seems to have settled down a bit as people have got used to working from home.
Yeah.
There are a boatload of, Corona podcasts and podcast episodes.
Yeah.
So do pick a reputable provider if you're, thinking of taking a new one up. And that's probably like, there's probably a hell of a lot of new Corona blog posts and Facebook groups and all of that sort of thing. There's not a lot of things like that are special to the medium, but people sort of, will treat them as, sort of a standout.
It's an interesting time for listening in general, because we were sort of talking about it before we started this session, is that everything that you would normally do is different because you can't do other things. So we were talking about that idea of, when you go for exercise, that could be a key time where you listen to a podcast. But now it's also been a time where you can actually meet another person and have a chat because, doing exercise with someone was considered okay to do during COVID-19. So it would be interesting to see how those new habits affect podcasting as we come out of the pandemic. Whether people go even more to the home because they're so used to listening to podcasts ambiently than what they used to.
Yeah, and the initially podcast listening dipped, I think, as everybody was sort of, desperately reading news about what was happening, and now it's bounced back to sort of almost pre-COVID levels. I think it might be down a couple of percent, but those stats are a little bit rubbery. But overall, we're sort of getting back up there. I can't wait to see what the new listening habits or new sort of normal will be like with podcasting, but there's not just podcasting, but audio is trying to push further in with smart speakers so that you can be consuming while you're at the basin washing your hands or brushing your teeth in the morning. So you've got this constant sort of like audio competes for your attention in places that screens can't.
Yeah.
And that, like your example with going exercising with somebody else, audio is competing with your social relationships, whereas Saturday night might have satisfied your social relationships, and audio can satisfy your, time spent exercising. There might be a new appreciation for, exercising with people in the coming months.
And so what about market saturation? How, given that podcasting as a technology is more accessible to people now, than taking up a new video series or something like that. What's it doing to the overall size of the market and the number of podcasts out there?
Well, the podcast, it's much easier than ever to start a podcast. So there's just more being created because of the barriers coming down. But podcasting has a power dynamic, which works that the people who can promote them the best, just continue to start more podcasts and promote them in increasingly better ways. And so the average number of listens to a podcast episode globally is about 127. And then if you want to get into the top 1%, it's over, I think, 30 or 40,000 downloads for one episode. Mm-hmm. So it comes back to the point about if you were starting one for your brand, you would start one, with purpose and, with a sort of an audience in mind that you want to satisfy a job for them or an information or a story to convey, rather than think, I'm going to, come in and, go wide and try and capture this sort of big thing, because it's not realistic depending on which brand you work for. And it may also not be beneficial, in terms of you might be overcommitting. Yep. In terms of like saturation specifically, knowing that there's a million podcasts out there, shouldn't stop anybody from making one. It might mean that some ideas double up, of course, or that, some topics like true crime are, very saturated, which is fine because, like I said, people don't stop writing books, making music. It's content in a way, an art form. So it should have infinite possibilities in terms of what can be produced. Plus, particularly for brands, maybe if you're in, tech or engineering or, art, science, anything, things are all constantly evolving.
Yeah.
So communicating those changes and sort of trying to sort of stay out in front is going to provide, large amounts of new and interesting content that people can't get in other places because they don't work in that industry or they don't have the same contacts.
So let's talk about, for all those people thinking of starting a podcast, I want to go through some of your learnings over the last, 10 years or so of podcasting, and what they can do to make sure that their podcast has the best chance at succeeding.
use a microphone when you get to recording. It's not too expensive, and there's plenty of articles online that can help you with choosing one. Have a clear purpose. Have a good host. Don't skimp on on the preparation time. So understand what your first 6 at least episodes are going to be. So many people have told me about their podcast, and it is just one episode. I'm like, well, what's the next episode? Oh, I haven't thought about that. But the first one's going to be really good. And you're like, well, you're going to spend a whole lot of energy making one show, and then, it's going to go nowhere because there's no continuity. Make time. Podcasting takes time. I said I was, lazy. I thought writing was cumbersome, and radio was much easier. Well, podcasting is much more cumbersome than writing. It takes a lot of time to prepare, record, edit, publish, put money into decent artwork. If you were going to get artwork made for your brand, you would probably put, time and effort and consideration into that.
Yeah.
Do the same for the artwork for the podcast, and also for the music on the podcast. If if you have a theme tune that goes, on a branded podcast, think about, does that theme tune represent the brand values?
Yep.
Look into sonic branding as well, or audio logos, where people put so much time and effort into visual logos, but then nothing into an audio logo, which, like HBO, that sort of sound.
Yeah.
Or the Audi, sort of the little talks that run across the bottom of the screen, or the Netflix audio logo. Now, those things are very memorable, and they can be used across video and also podcasting as well. Or even at the start of live streams or Zoom calls, that sort of thing, or at live events. So it's definitely something. Plus, if the branding is your sole job in an organisation, mentioning that in meetings can make it seem like you're sort of ahead of the curve as well, because not many people are doing it at the moment. Yeah. The other thing is commit time after you've recorded it to marketing and continuing it. There's people that I've worked with, and they will just bolt on the podcast to their workload rather than making space for it.
Yeah.
If you don't make space for it, because it's so new and it's sort of, they don't see, you won't have seen the benefits from it yet, it will quickly get, prioritized out of workflow. It drags on longer, people get frustrated, it hangs around and it doesn't get done. And then when it comes back around, it might actually be like a really, really good fit for some sort of campaign that you've got, and somebody says, why don't you do a podcast? The person who might have been involved back then will say, no, we had a go at it and it didn't work. And it's not that the podcast didn't work, it's that the people involved in the podcast didn't work.
Right.
That's a perennial frustration. I mean, people, I worked with on podcasting have put the time into it, and we've seen some great results from those clients, which has been really great to watch.
And what about
as well?
What about, Courtney, frequency? How often is there any correlation between success at podcasting and the frequency in which you release episodes?
The most common frequency is weekly. I would say weekly. And keep the episode length now the standard 30 minutes.
Right, okay.
There's sort of rumours about how podcast apps will prioritise shows that publish weekly. But if you're marketing it effectively, you can, and you maintain a constant contact or reasonable amounts of contact with your audience that are listening to it, then there's a good chance you can, keep them listening if you were doing fortnightly or monthly. But weekly is certainly the frequency to build an audience habit for podcasts.
So, I mean, it sounds like, at least for podcasting, even though there's lots being produced out there, there's always more sort of low hanging fruit. It's sort of like, saying that you wouldn't produce a TV series next year because there's too many already on Netflix. It doesn't necessarily, the volume of stuff out there doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's sick of it. It's just that there's more opportunity to look for a specific audience within that set. Does that say sort of make sense?
Yeah, I think everybody, if you just took, say, if you're sitting there thinking, if I'm starting a podcast for the brand, like what are we going to, talk about? Well, you and that brand have a specific set of contacts, networks, and access to information which is unique. Now, it's about gathering that sort of information, resources, stories, assets, whatever, and putting them together on a show, on a podcast that is, picking the most interesting ones or informative ones, and publishing it. It's not like, I don't think you should ever think, oh, there's a food podcast, I can't do a food podcast. But somebody, if you were, say Yarra Valley tourism, you could do a complete, a guide to the Yarra Valley in, 2021. Record that, and then for every person that comes through or is visiting the Yarra Valley in 2021, you send them this podcast, and as they're driving around in the car, they're listening to it with their partner. That's, you can always break it down and find the point of difference. I mean, why is there more than one tire company? Because the other tire company thinks that they can do it better.
Cool. Okay, well, that's all we got time for. Thanks very much, Courtney, for sharing all your wisdom with us. We will tweet out a bunch of insights from this episode. In fact, I think someone's already actually doing that, so check the Twitter feed. The full recording will be up after this, so if you missed the beginning, didn't quite get there in time, the full thing will be up there. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next episode, which should be coming to you in 2 weeks' time. Otherwise, thanks for watching.